Welcome back to our course on church history, and this is lecture number 7. And in this lecture we're going to talk a little bit about the rise of Islam and then about the Crusades. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about Islam and the Quran or anything like that. We're looking at it very much as one of those events within history that affected the church. And then we'll move on to talk about the Crusades, which were very much a response to the rise of Islam and its geographical progress. And that will pave the way for us in our next lecture to jump ahead about 500 years again and look at the Protestant Reformation. And some of the chief characters we'll look at then will of course be Calvin, Martin Luther, Henry VIII, and a number of other activities from that period. So to begin with, I'm going to just speak very briefly about Mohammed's life and work, and this will be what might be called a Western non-Muslim summary of Mohammed. And then I'm going to read a different version of that life. So Mohammed lived from 570 AD to 632 AD. He was born an Arab in Mecca, which is in modern day Saudi Arabia. At the time, Mecca was a trading centre on caravan routes from Syria to India. And Mecca was also a religious city. In the centre of the city was a building called the Kaaba, meaning cube. It was a cube-shaped building with a flat top, and in the wall of this building was a black stone, probably a meteorite that had fallen from the sky at some point, and which the people had seen as being sent from God. People from all over Arabia would come to visit the Kaaba and kiss the black stone. Mohammed's father, Abdullah, died while Mohammed was in his mother's womb, and his mother died when he was 6, and so he was reared, it's thought, by a grandfather and then an uncle. I've mentioned just there that Mecca was on the caravan route from Syria to India, and Mohammed became a successful caravan conductor, and he grew up disliking idols. In 595 he married a wealthy widow named Khadija, who was 15 years older than him, and they had 7 children while she lived, and in that period he took no other wives. He acquired a reputation for honesty, and he was influenced by both Christians and Jews. Tragically, the Christians he met never seemed to explain to him the gospel Paul preached, and so Mohammed never found saving faith in Jesus Christ. One missionary to Iran wrote, "There were Jews and Christians in various parts of Arabia at the time, but those who knew the one true God failed to make him known to the heathen. If the followers of Christ had made disciples of the people of Arabia as he commanded them to do, Mohammed would probably have become a Christian and might have rendered a great service to the cause of Christ." He meditated on life and death issues in solitude in the caves and quiet of the desert. By the time he was 40, he claimed that an angel had been sent to him, the angel Gabriel. And this took place approximately 610 AD during the month of Ramadan. And this is seen as the start of Islam, the beginning of Muhammad's call. And the angel told him to preach, and preach he did. He spoke initially of righteousness and the wrath of God. Muhammad saw his religion as a restoration and continuation of the religion of Abraham, and he said that there's only one God, and he denounced the many idols of Mecca. He proclaimed himself to be the last and true and greatest prophet of God. He said that God wanted him to confirm the truth of previous scriptures, the Jewish and Christian ones, but that they were now distorted by the splits and sects of those religions. The Jews failed and corrupted these scriptures, and the Christians failed by worshipping Jesus instead of God alone. As an interesting comment there, that continues to be an issue with people from Islam, that they, if you ask them about the Bible, they're likely to ask you which Bible, because they believe there are so many translations that along the way it's been corrupted, but they fail to recognize that there are various versions of the Quran also. His wife died in 619. She'd always believed Muhammad to be the true prophet. She was his first disciple. Another disciple was his 14-year-old cousin Ali, who later became his son-in-law. Another was Zaid, a slave Muhammad had freed and adopted. In 620, Muhammad's reputed night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem occurred, and then to the seventh heaven. His native city hated him and his message, and he was forced to leave Mecca. His flight or migration from Mecca to Medina, originally called Yathrib, took place on September the 22nd, 622, and it's called a Hirja, Hirja, and about 200 of his followers went with him. In Medina he set up his new religion, and the people there accepted him more readily. At first he tried to be friends with Jews, but they were firm in rejecting him, and he grew to mistrust them, and he expelled many from Medina and had others executed. He declared that there was to be a holy war, a jihad, the need to fight for the faith, and he attacked wealthy caravans from Mecca needing money and resources. He warred with Mecca, and Mecca warred with him. He eventually conquered them in 630, converting many by the sword. The entire population was converted to Islam, and the Kaaba was established as the religious centre of Islam. He remained a military leader as well as a prophet. He had all the idols and images of Kaaba destroyed, except, it is said, one picture of Jesus and Mary. He called people to prayer and exhorted them to be just in their dealings and not to avenge themselves and to give up idolatry. He adopted the black stone into his faith, and to this day pilgrims go to Mecca to kiss the black stone. In total, Muhammad had 12 wives, including 2 slave girls, and like Henry VIII, he wanted a son to succeed him, but none survived. On the 8th of June 632, Muhammad died in Medina. It was sudden. An intestinal tract disorder seemed to have been the cause, but within 20 years his new religion had gripped Arabia. Now let me read you a Muslim version, and if you just kind of stay with me on this, because it's quite a little lengthy note. As Muhammad grew up, he became known for his truthfulness, generosity and sincerity, so that he was sought after for his ability to arbitrate in disputes. The historians describe him as calm and meditative. Muhammad was of a deeply religious nature and had long detested the decadence of his society. It became his habit to meditate from time to time in the cave of Hira near the summit of Jazbal al-Nur, the Mountain of Light, near Makkah. At the age of 40, while engaged in meditative retreat, Muhammad received his first revelation from God through the angel Gabriel. This revelation, which continued for 23 years, is known as the Quran. As soon as he began to recite the words he heard from Gabriel and to preach the truth which God had revealed to him, he and his small group of followers suffered their bitter persecution, which grew so fierce that in the year 622 God gave them the command to emigrate. This event, the Hijra or migration, in which they left Mecca for the city of Medina, some 260 miles to the north, marks the beginning of the Muslim calendar. After several years, the Prophet and his followers were able to return to Mecca, where they forgave their enemies and established Islam definitely. Before the Prophet died at the age of 63, the greater part of Arabia was Muslim, and within a century of his death, Islam had spread to Spain in the west and as far east as China. You might have noticed some differences between the brief, what I described as Western non-Muslim summary, and that one, where there is no mention, for instance, of Muhammad robbing the caravan trains, etc. Let's look just very briefly at Muhammad's view of Christianity. Muhammad believed himself to be a prophet of God in the line and tradition of the great prophets of the Bible. Muhammad had always spoken of Jesus with reverence and respect, though he seems not to have understood the crucifixion. He believed Jesus escaped it. But he did affirm to believing in Jesus' virgin birth, resurrection and ascension. And he definitely had no idea or understanding of the atonement, and simply held that Jesus was a prophet. He believed that Moses had brought the law to the Jews, Jesus had brought the gospel to the Christians, and he had brought the Quran to the Arabs. Muhammad respected holy books of the Jews and Christians, and he called the followers of these two faiths the people of the book. He actually encouraged Muslims to show respect for people of these two religions, even if they disagreed with them on certain beliefs. What might have been some of the reasons for Muhammad's success? Excuse me. Some say he was a deeply religious man and God was with him. Some say he began as a deeply religious man and moulded into a shrewd political ruler. Others say he was politically motivated from the start, and some say that he had pathological motives. Some say that he was led by the devil and probably possessed. Whatever his motivation was, by worldly standards, he was very successful. To think for a moment about the spread of Islam. After Muhammad died, his friend and one of his earliest followers, Abu Bakr, succeeded him and became his first caliph or successor or deputy. He reunited certain tribes that wanted to desert Islam now that Muhammad was dead, and by the time of his death, 634, Arabia was won. The spread of Islam was already taking place, and as the years continued to pass, all the Semitic people except the Jews had become followers of Islam. South Babylon fell to the Muslims in 633. Damascus in Syria fell in 635. Jerusalem fell in 637. And upon taking Jerusalem, Omar, the third caliph, ordered the building of the Dome of the Rock, also called the Mosque of Omar. It is the oldest Muslim building outside of Arabia. In 640, the Arab armies entered Egypt and spread along North Africa. In 705, they entered India. In 711, the Arabs even entered Spain. And in 713, an Arab embassy visited the court of China. So Islam had taken over great swathes of Asia, Africa, and Europe. A turning point came in 732. In that year, the Islamic movement was finally stopped in France, where the armies of the Franks under Charles Martel defeated them. They were forced back into Spain and held on to Spain until the 15th century. If France had been lost, it's believed by many historians that nothing would have stopped the Muslims and that Europe would have become Muslim. So that's something of, just very briefly, the background to Muhammad and Islam and its move forward. By the 14th century, it had begun to spread into Turkey, Central Asia, India, China and Central Africa. Our concerns would be particularly around those areas of the Eastern Orthodox churches around sort of the Turkey area and around that area, where they came in and basically pushed back Christianity from those areas, and also brought about the loss of the empire of the East. Now the Eastern Christianity was able to survive, although it was very damaged in the East itself, but it was able to move forward and found itself placed very much in what is now Eastern Europe and up into to Russia. I want to talk now for a little while about the Crusades. A dark point really in Christian history and of the church. And maybe this continues to be one of the reasons of tension between Christians and Muslims, that they've really never forgiven Christians for what happened through the Crusades. Now, when we talk about the Crusades, we are not talking about one relatively restricted period of history, but we're talking about a period of about 200 years in which there were a series of wars that were waged, particularly against the Muslims, against Islam. And the consequences really are very poor as far as Christianity and Christianity's reputation is concerned. The very word crusade comes from taking the cross, and was used to say that if you went and fought, and people used to say if you went and fought in the Crusades, you were taking up your cross to follow Jesus. The Crusaders who went off to battle wore a cross on their chest, and on the way home they wore it on their backs. But the Crusades go down in history as a terrible blot against the Christian church. The atrocities and sufferings caused by these wars is hard to convey. Not only did Muslims get attacked by so-called Christian armies, but so did Jews and even other Christians. People were butchered, raped, and tortured. Augustine, the theologian from earlier centuries, had spoken of the just war, that there can be war conducted by the state in defence of life and property, so long as the combatants, hostages and prisoners were all respected. All his great ideals were ignored during the Crusades. They were somehow more than just wars. They were holy wars, or so it was described. Islam had been birthed and then grew from about 600 onwards, and the Muslim armies soon absorbed the area of land known as Palestine or Israel. But it did not ruin Christian pilgrimages. Pilgrims from Europe could still travel to the Holy Land, and many did, and all was going along peacefully until the 11th century. In this century, extremist Muslims began persecuting pilgrims, and they also seized the city of Jerusalem from their fellow Muslims and turned north to spread into Asia Minor. The Eastern Emperor, Alexius I, was facing defeat and losing territories to the new extreme Muslims. He wrote to the Western princes and the Pope asking for military help in order to regain lost territory. This and the rumours of persecution of pilgrims inflamed many in the West against the Muslims. And over the next 2 centuries, a number of crusades would occur. If I just turn to my notes for a moment, there were in total 7 crusades. So when we talk about the Crusades, we're talking about a period of 200 years and 7 crusades. What the goals were to win the Holy Land back from the Muslims for Christians to control. It was to check the advance of Islam. Thirdly, to ensure the safety of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. And fourthly, to help breach the growing gap between the Eastern and Western Christian Church. Some say that this goal was really to see the Roman Latin Church deepen its own influence in the East at the expense of the Eastern Greek Church. A new era of cooperation after the dark ages of barbarianism and fighting between factions. So we're going to look very briefly at each one of these Crusades and their dates and a little bit of the specifics of them and the results. And as I said, we need to be aware of these because they really were a period that we as Christians should not really be all too proud of. So the first Crusade. In 1095, Pope Urban II proclaimed the first crusade to regain the Holy Land, and he incited a huge crowd to take up their crosses, which were swords. One historian has called this speech the most influential speech in medieval history. And I'm going to just read an extract from the Pope's words. Quote, "It is the imminent peril threatening you and all the faithful which has brought us hither. From the confines of Jerusalem and from the city of Constantinople, a horrible tale has gone forth. An accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God, has invaded the lands of those Christians and has depopulated them by sword, pillage and fire. They have led away some of the captives of their own country, and others have been killed by cruel tortures. On whom rests the labour of avenging these wrongs and of recovering the territory, if not upon you, you upon whom, above all others, God has confirmed remarkable glory in arms, great bravery and strength to humble the heads of those who resist you. Let the holy sepulchre of our Lord and Saviour, now held by unclean nations, arouse you. Let none of your possessions keep you back, nor anxiety for your family affairs. Enter upon the road to the holy sepulchre, wrest that land from the wicked race, and subject it to yourselves. Jerusalem implores you to come to her aid. Undertake this journey eagerly for the remission of your sins, and be assured of the reward of imperishable glory in the kingdom of heaven." There's a lot one could comment on there, but just notice one of those last phrases, this call to undertake the Crusades, undertake this journey eagerly for the remission of your sins. So we're beginning even at this point to see something of what we will talk about later, of indulgences, that somehow it was possible to pay off some sins. And one of the ways to do that became very much to contribute towards the Crusades, and if not by going, to make financial contributions towards it. Pope Urban went on to outline in horrific detail the alleged atrocities done by Muslims against Christian men and women and children. Torture, rape and murder were all described in detail, and it incited the crowd to a wild frenzy, and the first crusade was launched. Excuse me. The medieval knights were inspired to go and defend the ravaged damsel in distress of Jerusalem. And the wild crowd initiated the slogan or battle cry of the first crusade: God wills it. Urban preached that good Christians would go to battle, and in so doing they would reap both spiritual and material rewards. If they won their battle, they could keep land that they conquered and make it their own. And he also said that all past sins would be forgiven for those who went. So the First Crusade consisted of feudal nobles from France, parts of Germany, and southern Italy. The nobles brought along those who were under them, peasants, to do much of the fighting, and they stood in contrast to the common, inexperienced armies that sprung up in response to a call from Peter the Hermit. When the different parts of the army fought the Turks, they had different outcomes. The rabble of commoners was easily defeated by the Turks, earning this crusade the title the Peasants' Crusade. However, the professional army of the nobles saw a different outcome. This army was quite successful, and it won back the Holy City for Christendom in 1099, and also won a strip of coastal land. It set up a feudal kingdom in its conquered territory and established it officially on Christmas Day 1100. The conquering of Jerusalem had not been atrocity-free, as judged by modern standards, and as judged even by Augustine's rule of war. Firstly, Jews were slaughtered along the way, and towns pillaged for resources. Bear in mind this is so-called Christian army. Once in the Holy Land, enemy soldiers that were caught were beheaded or had their limbs cut off. Others were shot with arrows or made to jump from towers. Others were tortured for several days before being burned in flames. Women and children were likewise killed. One report describes Muslim women having their babies ripped from their breasts by their feet to then be smashed against posts or flung over the city walls. 70,000 Muslims caught in the city were thus slain, and the Jews who had lived there fared no better. They were herded into a synagogue and burned alive. But the victors went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and gave thanks to God for the victory. The kingdom that was set up over the conquered land soon became typically feudal, and the majority of people living under the control of the wealthy nobles who had run this region grew to hate the new system. The Second Crusade dates from 1147, so almost 50 years after that first one. So maintaining the victory that had been won was to actually prove harder than winning it. Jerusalem was a long way from Europe, and so it was not long before Jerusalem was being threatened again by Muslims. Successful fighting by some Muslims led to the loss of some towns held by Christians, and there was fear that Jerusalem would fall to the Muslims again. In 1147, Bernard, a mystic who was from what is modern France, called for another crusade. The city of Jerusalem was appearing to look vulnerable. It needed to be protected. So Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany went off as leaders of this crusade. 2 years of fighting followed, but this time there was no great victory. Defeats and difficulties, including starvation, led to withdrawal and humiliation without victory. And the troubles of this army was enough to turn other potential crusaders off for a little while, though number 3 was still to occur. The Third Crusade occurred about 40 years later. In 1187, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, retook Jerusalem. It was not as bloody an affair as when the Christians took it during the First Crusade. Many of the 60,000 captured Christian civilians were freed, and about 15,000 went off to slavery. Saladin, you might say, was more noble than the Christians. Even the king of the Christian territory, King Guy, and many of his nobles were freed after they promised never to war against Saladin again. Saladin had taken Jerusalem and consecrated the Dome of the Rock to Muslim use. A cry went up in Christian Europe for another crusade. This was in 1189. 3 very famous European leaders took up the cause. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard I, Richard the Lionheart of England. Frederick was 67, years old, and he sadly drowned on the way. Philip, a very young king of only 23 years of age, went home after a number of disagreements with Richard. But Richard, who had only recently been crowned King of England and was still in his 30s, stayed to fight. It's not hard to respect Saladin. He was not keen for bloodshed, and he knew that bloodshed leads to bloodshed. Quote, "Blood that is spilt never slumbers." Saladin tried to negotiate a settlement by suggesting that Richard marry his sister and then be given Palestine as a wedding present. This was rejected, and fighting did take place. Again, excuse me. And fighting went back and forth with this. Finally, a 3-year truce was agreed upon, and free access to Jerusalem for Christians, pilgrims, was guaranteed. This was not really a great victory. It would have not have been agreed to by Saladin from the start, but then the Crusaders wanted to reconquer the whole land for Christendom. When Richard departed the shores of Palestine, he left a warning to Saladin: "I'll be back in 3 years to take Jerusalem." So again, not a very great outcome. The Fourth Crusade, Innocent III became Pope in 1198, and he called for a new crusade, but it was a total fiasco. It began in 1202, and this group of mercenaries never even got to Jerusalem. They ran into trouble trying to pay shipping costs to Venetians to get them over the sea. The Venetians were making a good profit on this crusade. At the urging of the merchant Dandolo, the Crusaders turned to Zara, a Christian town on the Adriatic coast and competitor of Venice, and attacked it. They sacked the city. Pope Innocent was so angry that he excommunicated all who went on the venture, though some Crusaders refused to play any part in it. The Crusaders were not finished, however, and they turned their eyes to Constantinople. They attacked and plundered that great Christian city in 1204 in order to pay their debt to Dandolo in Venice. They even attacked the church there. Not one Muslim died, but Christians did. They were about setting up a Latin empire there to replace the Greek empire that was ruling, and they decided not to bother going to Jerusalem at all. The Pope was at first appalled and furious, but that was then politically smart enough to see the advantage in what had happened. So he appointed a Western Archbishop for Constantinople who would serve his and the West's interests. The Latin Empire in Constantinople lasted until 1261, when it reverted back to the Greek Empire. But this whole messy affair only widened the gap between the East and the West of the Christian world, and the East never received from the sacking of Constantinople by the Crusaders. The next crusade is referred to as the Children's Crusade. Of all the crusades, this one was the most foolish and wasteful. It's called the Children's Crusade. In 1212, thousands of children were sent on a crusade. A 12-year-old French farm boy, Stephen of Cloyes, insisted that Christ had appeared to him while he was tending his sheep, and had instructed him to organise a children's crusade to take the Holy Land, and between 20,000 and 30,000 children followed him. Many died on the way as they travelled through France and Germany, and when the remainder got to the Italian coast, they embarked on hired boats to go to the Holy Land. But they had been hoodwinked, however, as the owner of the boats were slave traders. They got to Alexandria in Egypt, where they were betrayed and sold into slavery. Another 20,000 children who came down from Germany in the same way, following the German youth known as Nicholas, and they got no further than Italy. It had been a terrible journey. Hunger, wolves, thieves, sickness all took their toll. And the ones that got to Italy were not able to secure any vessels to take them over the sea. The Pope had issued a gentle plea to them to go home. Some straggled back home, many died on the journey, and some stayed in Italy, finding employment there. The Fifth Crusade, in 1217, a new crusade headed off to win Jerusalem by conquering Egypt firstly. It was led by the Hungarian king Andrew, and to start with went reasonably well, but it soon fell into stalemate. A compromise was finally made and an 8-year truce was signed, and the Crusaders returned home. On to the Sixth Crusade. In 1229, Frederick II, the young Emperor of Germany and Italy, regained control of the Holy Land by diplomacy. Frederick was the grandson of Barbarossa and was a most extraordinary man. He spoke 6 languages, including Arabic, and was very well educated for his times. He did not get on all that well with the papacy and suffered excommunication. But while in that state, he raised an army and went east. He met with the Sultan of Egypt, and by diplomacy only, he secured Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem for Christendom. This was the crusade that had no fighting, and it remained in Christian hands until 1244, when it was lost again to Muslims. The Seventh Crusade, Louis IX of France attacked Egypt in 1249. He was captured by the Egyptians and had to pay a huge ransom to be released. He got back home and organised himself to keep up the fight. And he went back in 1267 but died from dysentery at Carthage in 1270. Edward of England, a prince but later to be Edward I, had followed him in his crusade dream, and Edward went off to Acre but had no lasting victory before returning home to accept the crown of England. In 1291, the forces of Islam took Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. 60,000 Christians were massacred or taken as slaves. But the Crusades were over. This sort of event will raise all kinds of questions for us about how we enter into these situations. And with all of those deaths, not only of followers of Islam, but of Jews and Christians as well, it was a horrendously terrible time, 200 years, a horribly terrible time, and one that we should regret, really. We can't wipe it from history, as a lot of modern people like to do with historical events. We can't wipe it from history, but we can have a different attitude in these days. But what were some of the results of the Crusades? The goals of the original Crusades, which was to take back land, nations, in particular Jerusalem, from Islam, had not been achieved, but there were many other effects on the medieval world of the day. I'll run through with some of them, the results that had impact on trade, industry and culture. Trade between Europe and Asia Minor was stimulated significantly by the Crusades, and so economic development proceeded. The shipping industry in Italy needed to move troops and produce, so that shipping industry was stimulated. Glassmaking techniques improved as the skills of the Muslims in this area were copied. This impacted later Gothic churches, stained glass constructions, and Venetian glass techniques were really copied from the Muslims. European soldiers learned new skills and strategies from their Muslim opponents. Sugar and cotton and other common articles today first came to the attention of Europeans through the Crusades. Silkworms were cultivated for the cotton, and beautiful fabrics were made in Europe. Farmers planted apricot trees from Damascus and sugar cane from Tripoli. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg gave spices to European cooking. Glass mirrors came into use instead of polished metal discs, and steam baths became popular amongst European men. Secondly, there were benefits for architecture. The Europeans saw and liked houses with large windows, not just slits, Persian carpets, wall hangings and furniture inlaid with mother of pearl. Medical tips were learned from the Muslims. Agreeable medicines made of rose jam and spiced cream were much more appealing than medicines made out of cat's grease and stewed slugs, for example. Education, medieval learning was also stimulated as people came into contact with different ways of doing things. Lots of Arabic words entered the European language. Some say there were over 1,000 words. Economy, the feudal system was being chipped away at. To raise finances for the wars, feudal lords sold freedom to whole towns and individual serfs. Towns were growing and becoming stronger and proud. The economy became based on money and not bartering as a result of the Crusades. And in terms of the church, the power and the prestige of the church, although improved by the first crusade, was greatly undermined by the rest. The weakening of Christian belief accompanied the failures. Religious attitudes, Muslim powers, once tolerant of religious diversity, had now grown not to be. So there's not much more that we have to say in this particular lecture. It's been important if we were studying, let's say, history, particularly world history or British history, European history. We might look in more details at the specifics of each one of these crusades. But as I said earlier, it was important for us to touch on the crusades in this course, because they are a part of our church history. Not the best part, to say the least, but they were a part of our history. And hopefully, as Christians look back over those sorts of things, we would have a different approach. And of course, we live in a different age altogether. And I think we would today, whilst we still believe that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth and the life, and would want all people to come to know him, at the same time we have a respect for the religious groups, and we have respect for people who are not of the same faith as us. I was recently at a conference, and as my wife and I were entering every day, we got to know a member of the staff from the conference centre, and who was very clearly, one could tell by his hairstyle and his beard style, was obviously Islamic, and his name was Mohammed. But every morning, although he was being paid to do his job, he was in a sense serving the people who were coming to the conference. And every morning my wife and I would stop and have a conversation with this young man and just be friendly towards him. Many other people might have walked past. But this is just by way of a personal illustration, the kind of attitude that we can have to people of other races. Today, I'm sure there are not many of us listening to this and watching this video who would not buy things from a shop that is run by Muslims. We wouldn't avoid them just because of that. So we have that respect for humanity, and ought to have, I think, great regrets because of what happened to not only Muslims and not only Jews, but Christians as well, because of the Crusades. So next time we're going to leap forward again to what is the mid to late 1500s, the 16th century, and begin to think about the 16th century Reformation.